The first one is going to be about changes and a new part incorporated for occupiable outdoor areas. So about 2 or 3 years ago, some people were raising some questions to the ABCB about how do you treat rooftop bars and things like this. They were emerging more and more in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, and going, what are the actual requirements for an occupiable outdoor area? The building code deals with things as if they're a story, where an occupiable rooftop space will generally not have a roof, so for the purpose of the code, wouldn't actually be considered to be a story. So the question is, what are the requirements that apply? And it's not just a matter of a rooftop bar. There's also, and I'm seeing it more and more in Canberra, where we're seeing podium type construction, where the first 3 floors it might be car parks, and then you have an open area that might have a pool and other things out into that podium area, and then you have your apartments above, or might have a sky garden in one of the buildings in Canberra as well. So and you look at these types of buildings and you go, what are the exit requirements? What are the distance to travel to exits? Are there any fire hazard properties requirements you might need to treat in that area? What are the requirements? How about exit signage? So the ABCB looked at it and there was a bit of a gap in the code, and acknowledging there was a bit of a gap in the code. And one option might have been just to call it a story. But if you call it a story, there's a lot of provisions that would be well and truly over the top and unnecessary because it's open to the sky. And these buildings haven't been without incident. There was a fire a number of years ago over in Las Vegas in an occupiable outdoor area where they had palm trees, synthetic turf, and had all these things. Everyone got out and everyone got to a place of safety, but you just seen the smoke billowing out of it, and it was a fairly high risk building, high occupancy as well. So a new part G6 has been incorporated into the code for occupiable outdoor areas, and it's important to understand the definition. And it means a space on a roof, balcony or similar part of a building that's open to the sky, which access is provided other than access only for maintenance, and is not an open space or directly connected with an open space. Further to that, it goes to clarifying that the area doesn't apply to an occupiable area that's for a sole occupancy unit for a class 2 or 3 building, or an occupied area with a floor space less than 10 square metres. What this is to overcome, it's not to apply to private balconies, wouldn't apply to a penthouse apartment that has its own rooftop space. It's for rooftop spaces that are for public access, or those podium type ones as I mentioned. Not per se a room that might be associated to a hotel that might be a smoker's room or something like that. Not that intention at all. It's to be those areas open to the public more broadly. Like other parts of the code, such as farm buildings provisions or the atrium provisions, it doesn't tell you all the things you need to do for an occupiable outdoor area. What it does is give you concessions from other areas that would consider to be unnecessary for this part. Similar to like a rooftop car park or something like this. And it also clarifies that the provisions of this part take precedence where there might be a difference with the deemed to satisfy provisions of other parts to the code. So the new part varies out requirements for fire hazard properties. It doesn't apply the whole of C110, it only applies some select provisions of C110. It has some fire separation requirements, concessions. The provision for escape and exits are different so rather than, would say, for the purpose of this part, it's not considered a story, and instead you use this provision where you would be treating the construction of an exit. That's the sort of way that it's been drafted into the code. So if you're dealing with these types of buildings, then this is an area you should be really looking at this stuff. Has anyone had to deal with one of these buildings already and had to work out how to navigate your way around the code? Some people were using it as if it was a story anyway. Others were using it and applying it as if it was an open deck car park and applying some similar type of approaches to it. And now this provides certainty for you. Okay, getting into the section J changes. And my first one is that The provisions were already highly complex. Now they're really, really, really complex. And then with what Vanessa mentioned earlier for the ACT, with some of the differences being there, I think I could add an extra really onto that complex as well. So the provisions are subject to a significant stringency increase. These are based on a National Energy Productivity Plan, which was determined by the COAG Energy Council, so all the state and territory energy ministers and federal energy ministers, that for the 2019 code there will be stringency increases for commercial buildings and then for residential buildings for 2022. So I said that wrong way around. For 19 for commercial buildings and for 2022 for residential buildings. So for the commercial buildings, these are the changes that will increase the stringency. There will also be further changes going forward as well for commercial buildings as well. They're going to have a significant impact on cladding manufacturers and suppliers and the way that they determine their wall systems. It only applies to commercial buildings, but as I mentioned a few times today, that it does apply to common areas, but it also applies to shared services for these buildings. And then for mixed-use buildings, it will certainly apply to those mixed-use parts of the building. It won't apply to the individual SOUs themselves, but whether buildings are going to be constructed differently, where it's a mixed-use and have it constructed one way for the commercial and the mixed-use part, and then constructed a different way for the SOUs, the fabric for the SOUs, who knows? It's going to be much more complex, and there's going to need to be a much more integrated approach between the building designer, the energy assessor, the cladding manufacturers, and therefore the builder as well, and the designer and the developers. It's also going to have probably the biggest change is it's changed from an approach where you might say the external wall in this this climate zone needs to meet a total R value of R3.8. Now it's going to say you need to do a window to wall ratio calculation, looking at what orientation the facade covering is going to be on, what windows might go into that wall, and putting that all together to come up what the total U value of the wall system is going to be. That could be quite different for each individual orientation of that building. So very, very complicated approach. And for building certifiers and others to get you already needed to have that one assessment done for the SOUs and one for the commercial areas. This is now going to be a much more sophisticated thing that's going to have to come across your desk than probably has been done in the past. So, to go to the cladding manufacturers and say, okay, I want a system that gives me an R value of R3.8, they're going to be able to say, well, when they really find it difficult to do that because we don't know what orientation your wall's going to be on, we don't know what windows are going to go into that wall. All we can really tell you is what our R value for our individual element itself achieves. So it's going to be a very complicated approach. One of the interesting ones with this, when it went through out for public comment, the energy efficiency provisions got over 3,000 comments. That's, in my time in building codes boards and public comments on things, it's hard enough to get comments. That level of comment is phenomenal. And it wasn't just I don't support this and everyone copy and pasting the same comment. There was a lot of substantial comments to the effect of all the stuff we're raising today and more about this stuff and about the impact on products currently in the market, systems, design, how complex the provisions are already and where they're going to, and all of this stuff, and moving away from minimum necessary regulation into aspirational sort of provisions as well. Impact it's going to have on windows. The window industry was extremely concerned, talking about the size of windows that's going to be able to be going into some of these buildings to comply. Glazed curtain wall systems are going to make it very difficult to comply as well without some sophisticated engineering. Yeah, there's a lot of work being done on non-conforming building products more broader than energy efficiency. We've been one of the industry associations that's trying to push to get greater controls around it because, at the end of the day, builders and certifiers at the end of the supply chain, are getting lumped with this stuff, and sometimes you don't know one from the other. It might look and smell and look all the same, but to try and get better controls that are spread across the supply chain. Queensland brought in some legislation end of 2017 about non-conforming building products and the supply chain legislation. We'd like to see something like that introduced across the country, but there's still fundamental issues with the Queensland legislation in terms of its practical application as well. Yep. So in terms of the energy efficiency stuff for apartments, there's those same split heating and cooling load limit requirements for apartments. So in addition to getting your star rating, it still will allow that approach of having your 6-star and 5-star across the board, where you might have, an individual apartment might be 5-star, but overall the building, all the apartments need to achieve a 6-star, which takes account of, west-facing apartments, which also were quite difficult to comply. As I mentioned, there's significant stringency increases for the common areas and the mixed use and shared services for these buildings, so that's going to affect the designs. There's also the inclusion of the blower door test method, which I touched on this morning, which could be used as a optional means of meeting the building ceiling provisions in lieu of using Part J3. It's now all under a single performance requirement, where previously it used to be under 2 performance requirements, one for fabric and one for services. That will make some performance solutions quite difficult, where it might want to isolate out one specific component for a specific reason, where it will need to have more of a holistic approach to it. And as I mentioned, here's the stuff for nationally, the transitional arrangements, and when we get clarity from the ACT government on when it might be for a transitional arrangement, we'll let industry know as well.
What I'm really surprised about is they haven't brought in some kind of compensation for people who are installing solar panels.
Yep.
And given some kind of
Yep.
credit,
Yep.
some kind of
Yep.
cross credit,
Yep.
so that there's a system in place for
Yep.
that.
Yeah. So JV3 does allow some elements of trading such as that, but not a great deal. But going forward, that's specifically some of the stuff that we've been looking at for where they're looking to increase stringency for residential buildings, is not just keep targeting the fabric, but look at trading, look at renewables, look at all this sort of stuff, where we'd like to see it rather than continually targeting the building fabric.
Yeah, well, it's an additional cost.
Yep, absolutely.
If you offset that cost
Yep.
against
Yep.
harvesting, then you might reduce some of the
Yep.
cost of the actual.
Yep.
Just always thinking about the building,
Yep.
the building envelope.
Yep.
Let's think about
That's
engaging in harvesting
Yep.
solar.
that's
That's
that's been a big part of our submissions to government around energy efficiency provisions, and has been for a while and will continue to be. Is generally the simple approach is to target the building fabric, but the building fabric's at its pressure point. You should be looking at renewable energy, looking at offsets and things like this, which will make the real impact rather than just continually lumping more on the fabric. So here are those requirements where they exist for the heating and cooling load limits in JO2. And it's been plugged in now to have those separate heating and cooling load limits, and they'll be prescribed in an ABCB standard. Again, we'll once we find out exactly when those are going to take effect in ACT, we'll let you know. And this is the ABCB standard that lists out the different heating and cooling load limits based on the different climate zones around the country. And this hasn't been published yet, but it's in the finalising. But really, we've been trying to push to ensure that this gets integrated as part of energy assessment compliance tools, so you're not having to do dual assessments from meeting a star rating, then also having to meet a separate heating and cooling load limit requirement. And then to add to the complexity for a commercial building, also meeting your common area requirements and potentially mixed use assessments as well. Here's the blower door test method, just a picture again, and I talked about it this morning, so I won't go into more detail. And the building ceiling provisions of J3 have had some other concurrent changes just to make them more prescriptive in many, and trying to get rid of some of the more qualitative terms there. I won't go through everything else now, but there has been some changes to the Australian standards applicable to apartments, and they include those ones that I mentioned this morning do all have equal application, or do apply both to houses and apartments. There are a number of other ones I mentioned earlier that are listed in your summary of changes that also affects Class 2 to 9 buildings. One that I didn't touch on this morning was changes to AS 5113, the facade assembly testing standard. There hasn't been substantial changes to this document. This document was included as part of that outer cycle amendment to the code. There's been a lot of people asking, trying to get their products tested to this standard, and they're falling a lot of difficulty with that falling debris criteria of the standard. There's also been some misunderstanding of the application of this standard. I mentioned this morning people asking for 5113 test certificates for bricks and concrete and all this sort of stuff. So trying to make it clear, made it clearer about its application as it applies to facade systems that contain combustible elements. They haven't fixed the issue on the falling debris criteria, but what they have put into this standard is where you might not meet one of the aspects of the design criteria requirements that you may need to do. You may want to consider undertaking a risk assessment and looking at a risk assessment that and gives some types of things that should be considered as part of undertaking a risk assessment. Okay, I mentioned this morning that we are selling the code, the hard copy, and there's the order forms there on your desk. And if you put it in now before the end of this month, that you can also receive that $50 Caltex Star Cash fuel card. I won't go into more detail on this one, but again, it forms part of our national series of seminars. And again, we thank our sponsors for all their support, and I'm happy to take any questions, but I know we've had a lot of questions throughout. And so again, I thank you for your time today and really appreciate you staying on, and really appreciate any feedback you have or from any of your team going forward. So thanks very much.
Any clarification of what we can use in soffits and underslabs with phenolic and